What are rights? Where do rights come from? Do we make them up as we go? Are there certain unalienable rights that may not be taken from us? What's the difference between rights and privileges? What's the difference between human rights and civil rights? Is there a genetic disposition to having rights? Do you know your rights? Join us as we talk with Professor Benjamin Gregg from the University of Texas Department of Government. Professor Gregg holds a PhD in politics from Princeton and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin. Together we will explore the meaning and struggle for rights in a civilized society. Professor Gregg will help us explore the meaning of rights, human, civil, social, and perhaps others. You're watching Access News, hands-on news. Thank you for being here with us. Let's start by discussing rights. How do you define rights?
I'm happy to tell you how I would define rights. This allows me to say immediately that there is disagreement about what rights are. A fundamental distinction is between rights that we are certain about because we know where they come from, for example, from a legislature by persons that are elected, and laws that would, in a state, for example, have to comply with the Constitution. But there is a different line of thought that claims that there are also rights that are not from humans. This could be a metaphysical viewpoint, this could be a theological viewpoint, and there's a good reason to want to be able to say sometimes that there are rights that don't come from humans. For example, in the former East Germany, a citizen had no right to leave the country, and some citizens attempted to leave without permission, and the border guards had instructions to shoot them, and they killed a number of them. After the reunification of Germany, some of those border guards were prosecuted for murder. They could say, well, they were simply following East German law. And someone might want to say, well, even though it was legal in East Germany, in some sense that really is unacceptable. On the other hand, when people talk about laws or rights that are not from human beings, they can't agree on where they come from and even what they are. It's interesting to note that, for example, our legal system, including opinions by the Supreme Court, do not draw upon this notion of some kind of supernatural law or rights. I would define a right as an idea. It's like paper money, for example. If you compare paper money with a page from a newspaper, one will buy you things and the other won't. The difference is not the paper. The difference is in the mind of the participants. A right is an idea, and it's not an idea that has any future if it's shared only by one person, but within a community, if it's recognized, you have a right.
That makes sense, and that makes me think rights compared to privileges. You know, some people feel that those are the same. Is there a difference there?
Oh, to be sure. A privilege probably allows you some advantage. And some rights allow advantages, but other rights are define a basis upon which we can do things. For example, I wouldn't say that the idea of one man, one right is a privilege. It is a privilege for the citizen vis-a-vis the non-citizen. But among citizens, the idea that every person has a right to vote, but only one vote, is not a privilege. It's a fundamental provision for a democratic system.
Sometimes people perceive privilege as, say, their right as a citizen in the country to do X, Y, and Z. But the right is a written law. Can you give me more examples of exactly how they're different? I want our audience to really understand that sometimes they think that they do have a right, but maybe it's in fact a privilege. Can you give us more examples?
Well, first of all, the question of whether or not it's written is not necessarily the point. That is to say, you could have a right that is not written, and you could have
Like what?
Well, I mean, England, for example, doesn't have a written constitution in the sense of the United States, but they still have supreme law.
Okay, so let's move on and discuss why rights are important. Seems there's a lot of support as far as you mentioned rights are an idea. Rights are a huge part of our government system. Are rights put in place to control our society? Is that why rights are important?
Rights do a lot of work for us. Rights are a kind of rule, and we might not like some rules, but in general, we humans love rules. They do so much work for us. Right now, for example, you and I can communicate because we are following linguistic rules, rules of communication. We couldn't be having this conversation right now if we didn't have agreement about where to meet and when to meet and so forth. Those are also rules. Rights are a type of rule, and they do any number of types of work. For example, some laws in the Constitution concern how we arrange our political system. We have 3 branches of government, for example. Other rights, famously in the first 10 amendments, concern the rights of the individual vis-a-vis the state. The state has, or the government may have rights vis-a-vis the individual and so forth. Those are different from rights that you might have, for example, within your religious community, which may not be legal rights, but rights that would apply to members of that community who are free to leave if they wish. And therefore they follow those, or enjoy those rights only as a member of the community, whereas you would enjoy rights in the political community as a member of that community. Although you might also have rights, for example, when you travel to other political communities, into foreign countries, you don't lose all of your rights. Again, a member of our society who joins the military is restricted in some of his or her rights, for example, with regard to what they wear or what they do with their hair and so forth. And those are not regarded necessarily as infringing their basic rights, but one needs to understand that the military is a special community and it will have its own rights and privileges.
Okay, if I wanted to know specifically what are my rights, I wanted a clear definition. What I have a right to do and what I don't have a right to do. How do I find that information? I want a very clear description of my rights.
The first question is, in what context? For example, do you wish to know your rights as an American citizen, your rights as a citizen of the state of Texas, as someone who lives in Austin? Would you like to know your rights as a member of this sporting club, or your rights as a member of this, let's say, political action committee?
Valid point. There's obviously a lot of questions that I need answered, but let's start with, as an American citizen, what's the right place where I can find out about my rights?
Well, first of all, you should begin with the Constitution.
Right.
And one needs to understand that the Constitution, like any set of rules, does not interpret itself. It needs to be interpreted. And therefore, you begin with what is written in the Constitution, but that is not where you can stop. The question is, how is the Constitution properly interpreted? Good people, knowledgeable people, people of good faith disagree. And over the years, we see very, very significant disagreements. We will have a controlling interpretation in terms of, for example, majority on the Supreme Court. And that will tell you what your right is, for example.
I'm happy that you brought up the disagreements as far as what the interpretation is of the Constitution and of rights. Some people say that rights are divine, that they come from God. But we often struggle to define rights, or have over the years. So, for example, long ago we were allowed to own slaves. We had that right. And women did not have the right to vote. And obviously that has both changed. So it seems that rights have been a real human struggle for many years, that people fight to change rights. So is it a human struggle or something that is divine?
The struggle is very undivine. For example, the interpretation of the Constitution with regard to slavery led to the greatest crisis in the history of the United States, the Civil War. And this, if you will, legal disagreement was not solved by law. It was solved by the other of law, violence, war.
Unfortunately, yeah.
The struggle over interpretation, over authoritative interpretations, is inherent in the very process of law. We will never achieve a place where we don't disagree, all of us. We will always probably argue, because in part what a law means has to do with presuppositions that you bring to that law from different traditions and so forth. And we don't have in human society a source to which we could appeal that could adjudicate it for us. You might say, well, perhaps God could do that, but the difficulty there, of course, is, first of all, not everyone agrees about God, or if there is a God, or what kind of God, and how to access him, and who speaks for him, and so on and so forth. Moreover, in a country such as the United States, with the First Amendment, which protects your right to your religion, but also your right to be free of religion, to use a divine source for interpreting the Constitution, for example, would be an unconstitutional coercion of someone without faith to accept a faith-based interpretation of the Constitution.
So let's say same-sex marriage, for instance. Is that unconstitutional or constitutional? So that, the Constitution can affect our rights, and we believe that same-sex marriage will eventually become a right, correct?
It would appear so from the trend of more and more federal states embracing the right of same-sex partners to marry. Is it constitutional? The Constitution does not speak directly to this issue. In fact, many issues of constitutional jurisprudence are based more on the interpretation than explicit words in the Constitution. But we are not in a vacuum when we ask the question, for example, whether or not persons of the same faith have a right to marry, because this is also an issue of equality, of fairness, and of the right to be different and so forth, self-determination, the right to privacy, self-determination. And we have a large body of jurisprudence, and we can draw upon that, it seems to me, in deciding whether or not we could, of course, amend the Constitution to say that there is explicitly such a right, but it's very difficult to amend the American Constitution, that by design. On the other hand, we interpret the Constitution all the time, and you might regard an authoritative interpretation of the Constitution as a kind of amendment. And I imagine that we may well get to equality for same-sex couples through constitutional interpretation rather than through constitutional amendment.
You make very valid points, but why do you think that it's still a struggle for our country to come to an agreement on the issue? Why is it such a hot topic, so controversial?
The family is always a hot topic. People feel very, very passionate about family issues. These involve visions of dignity and worth and relationship. And our country has traditionally given a great deal of freedom for individual families to decide certain matters for themselves. And this is an issue that people feel is often informed also by, for example, their religious beliefs, and their passions are strong. But we are not a homogeneous people. No people is homogeneous. Every human population is marked by different interpretations and so forth. And therefore, the differences are expectable, and they are deep, and any decision that's made, or any interpretation that becomes authoritative, necessarily, or I said is guaranteed to make certain people unhappy, because they will not abandon their presuppositions, even though they might regard the law as binding. This would also be the case, for example, with regard to law on abortion or other issues. It's also a family issue, of course.
I'm happy you brought up abortion, actually. One thing that I've learned related to your work is that you're not only in politics, but also genetics. Can you tell me a little bit more about the correlation between politics and genetics and how science is involved?
Biotechnology, or genetic manipulation, is a central aspect of human community. We humans, like dogs and pigs and cats and sheep and so forth, those are all genetically manipulated, not in a laboratory. Many of our foods, rice and wheat and corn and so forth, are also the product of genetic manipulation, making possible more food and making possible the transition from hunter-gatherer society to culture, where people are settled and have time to develop religion and philosophy and science. We are today in the situation of a very rapid increase in our knowledge of genetics, and the question poses itself to us today, and we're not prepared to answer it. What happens, or what are the moral and legal and ethical implications, possible implications, of the human species taking control of its own genome? That is to say, in the past, a human being would be manipulated only in the gentle sense of a man and a woman agreeing perhaps to make a child, but at that point the genes will decide a great deal of the nature of that child. But now, when it's possible for humans actually to manipulate, let's say, an embryo, we're in a position of where a human being, in part, could be much more a product of a third party's preferences or will or decision. And we have to ask ourselves as a society whether or not, for example, that would in any way endanger what we regard as perhaps the fundamental freedom and self-determination of an individual. This question is not itself scientific. It is a normative or moral or ethical and legal question that is generated by our remarkable technological and scientific capacity. Science itself is not a normative enterprise. It does not tell us how we should behave. It gives us tools. And the question of how we should behave is the task of human community. It's the task, I believe, that ennobles us as humans. I would argue that we become ethical and moral by the quality and nature of the rules, the rights that we give ourselves, hopefully always aware with great humility of how frail we are. Because when we look at history, we can always see a great deal of injustice, And it's unlikely that we live in a special time, and it's unlikely that the future will look back at us and criticize us for a number of practices and beliefs that we regard as self-evident, but the future will regard as barbarous, the way we, for example, would regard slavery, which was surely a definite part of the landscape of human civilization for thousands and thousands of years. Today, totally unacceptable. And the difference is what we've done with our heads.
I'm sure our audience is curious about, where this discussion will go in the future, because, it's not just about being related to deafness, because it's not just about genetics. With deafness, the deaf community has its own culture and language and so forth, and the community sees this topic impacting that culture, and this is something that could possibly eliminate deafness. My friends, for instance, went to a sperm bank, chose exactly, red hair, green eyes, that kind of thing, exactly the genes that they were looking for, and they specifically wanted a deaf donor so that they could have deaf children. What are your thoughts on that matter, and where do you think that we need to draw the line and say that, that isn't ethical and, something less is okay? What are your thoughts on that?
This is a very large question. It's one of the largest questions we humans will ever face, because the fundamental question is, really, what is a human being? And in part, the answer to that question is a cultural question. It'll have a cultural cast to it. That is to say, we are humans biologically, but we're also humans culturally. That is to say, with regard to deafness, for example, the question there might be, what is the norm? What should the norm be? Is deafness somehow abnormal, and that sense needs to be changed? Or is it a variety, just as we would say that blue eyes are not abnormal compared to brown eyes, but rather a variation? The debate is easier when we talk about terrible scourges like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Down syndrome, where we would perhaps engage in therapy. But the much more difficult question is the kind of question you ask, and that is, to the extent that we can manipulate genes in terms of our preferences, we need standards by which to decide what is human, what is inhuman, what is normal, what is abnormal. And those standards, I would argue, are standards that we will give ourselves as a political community. That is not easy. And the differences are great within the community. And I can think, though, nonetheless, of no form of political organization better able to enter this very, very difficult field than a democratic one, in which the participants are informed and sincere. And even though even at the end of the day we won't be of the same mind, I think we can do justice in the sense that those who are disappointed by the ultimate decision can nonetheless regard it as legitimate. And one needs to bear in mind, of course, also certainly with rights and the law, is that it's open-ended, and that the future inevitably will bring changes that may change our opinions.
And change
today.
is good.
Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, although I do believe that if you read the history of the interpretation of the United States Constitution, in general, it's better. The effort is to be more inclusive, not less inclusive, to include women, to include people of color, and so forth. That's the clear trajectory. And with regard to your question about deaf persons and genetic manipulation, perhaps the same spirit there would be an approach that is inclusive of difference rather than exclusive, rather than an attempt to create the human as such, rather than to celebrate the wide variety within our population as human beings, within our species.
Diversity is really one of the most exciting things that I think humans bring. The culture, all the things that we discussed earlier before we started here, what languages and so forth. I'd hate to see those things disappear. Thank you, Professor Gregg, for being with us today on Access News. I really enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
You can learn more about the work of Professor Gregg by reading his latest book titled Human Rights as Social Construction. Or go to our website, accessnews.us, where you may ask questions and share your comments and opinions. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions we make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin.
Created, written, and executive produced by Devorah Ben-Moshe and Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara Suiter-Ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara Suiter-Ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Special thanks to Texas School for the Deaf. Funding provided by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Supported by Austin Community Foundation. Production by Austin Community College. Civication Incorporated. www.civication.org.